Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a look at the South China Sea.
Hmm.
It's one of those areas that might have seemed, I don't know, like minor disputes a while back, but now, certainly by April 2025, it's really right at the center of global geopolitics.
Absolutely front and center.
So if you're listening because you want to get up to speed quickly, really understand the core issues, maybe find some surprising details without getting totally overwhelmed, then yeah, you're in the right place.
Good place to be.
Our mission today, basically, is to unpack why the sea matters so much, get into the main disagreements, and figure out what's really at stake for, well, the future global order. We're drawing on some really insightful articles looking at the current situation and the history behind it all.
And it's striking just how fast things have shifted, isn't it? From sort of a marginal concern to a real flashpoint.
Definitely feels that way.
I mean, you look now, and the environment is visibly tense. You've got warships patrolling, heavily armed coast guards, these maritime militias operating,
Right.
and islands that have literally been built up and militarized.
It's quite a picture. And you mentioned China's role that seems to be a key driver here. This transformation, their assertiveness.
Oh, hugely. Their actions, like reclaiming reefs, building structures, imposing these fishing restrictions, it's dramatically changed the situation for neighboring countries and, of course, for the U.S.
And the U.S. hasn't just been watching from the sidelines.
No, not at all. The response has been pretty clear. Strengthening alliances in the region, boosting military deployments, even economic initiatives. It's all geared towards, countering China's ambitions there.
It really does feel like you said, a flashpoint. People use the term powder keg,
Yeah,
and maybe that's a bit strong, but maybe not. The idea that a small incident could spark something much bigger seems worryingly plausible.
it does. Which brings us to the question, why? Why all this fuss over this particular patch of water?
Yeah, what makes it so critical?
Well, fundamentally, it's the maritime lifeline for a huge chunk of the global economy. And strategically, it's like the fulcrum for the whole Indo-Pacific,
The economic numbers are just staggering when you look at them.
aren't they? Over, what, $5.3 trillion in trade passes through there every year? That's nearly a third of all global shipping.
A third. Wow. And the energy side is just as critical, right?
Even more so, arguably. Over a third of the world's crude oil, more than half of global liquefied natural gas, LNG.
Yeah.
It all transits through those sea lanes.
And you've got those key choke points, the Straits, Malacca, Sunda, Lombok.
Exactly. And their importance, especially for oil, actually surpasses even the Suez and Panama canals combined in terms of volume.
That really puts it in perspective. And think about the dependence of major economies. China, Japan, South Korea.
Oh, absolutely critical. China gets something like over 80% of its imported energy through there. Japan and South Korea, it's over 60%. India, too, heavily reliant.
So any disruption, I mean, you can barely imagine the shockwaves, global supply chains, market.
It would be massive, cascading effects everywhere.
Right.
And that's just the shipping on the surface. Then you've got the resources under the seabed.
Right, the oil and gas reserves.
Estimates vary, but think around 11 billion barrels of oil, maybe 900 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Plus, the fisheries are incredibly rich. Over 10% of the global fish catch comes from this area.
So if you control the sea, it's not just symbolic, it's real economic leverage, real strategic dominance.
Precisely. It gives you the power to influence regional dynamics, potentially deny access to rivals, project military power outwards.
And that frames the big picture contest, doesn't it? China wanting to break what it sees as U.S. encirclement, become the top dog in Asia.
And the U.S., on the other side, focused on maintaining freedom of navigation, preventing that kind of regional hegemony, arguing it's essential for global stability.
Okay, so the stakes are incredibly high, we get that. But let's dig into the roots of the conflict itself, these overlapping claims. Where do they actually come from? It sounds messy.
It is messy, deeply rooted in history, competing national narratives, strong nationalistic feelings. China's claim, the famous nine-dash line, is based on maps from the Republic of China back in 1947, plus arguments about historical usage.
But that line covers a huge area, right? And it's definitely not accepted by everyone else.
Not even close. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan, they all have their own counterclaims. Based on their own histories, different interpretations of international law like UNCLOS, and simply, geographical proximity.
And are there specific spots that are particularly contentious? Hot spots within the hotspot?
Oh, yes. Key areas are the Paracel Islands. China took full control there in 1974, but Vietnam still claims them. Then the Spratly Islands, which are much more scattered, with bits claimed or occupied by several different countries.
And Scarborough Shoal. That rings a bell.
Right, Scarborough Shoal. That became a real flashpoint in 2012 after a standoff. China effectively gained control, pushing out the Philippines.
And that's what led the Philippines to take China to international arbitration, wasn't it? Under UNCLS.
Exactly. The Philippines initiated arbitration under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and in 2016, the tribunal delivered a pretty landmark ruling.
Which basically invalidated China's 9-line claim under international law.
That's the gist of it, yes. It found no legal basis for China's historical rights claims within that line, a major legal victory for the Philippines.
But China's reaction was predictable.
Predictable, perhaps. They flat out rejected the ruling, called it null and void, basically ignored it, and just continued their activities.
So despite the ruling, they kept asserting control.
Pretty much, yes. Building military facilities on artificial islands, setting up administrative districts. The other claimants often find it hard to push back effectively, given China's economic and military weight.
And China uses more than just its navy, right? These fishing militias.
That's a key tactic. Using large numbers of fishing vessels, often state-supported, as a kind of maritime militia to assert presence and pressure other claimants, blurring the lines between civilian and military action.
So it's this tangle of history, law, power, politics, nationalism. And it feels like the gap between international law and the reality on the water is just getting wider.
That's a very good way to put it. And a prime example of that widening gap is this whole island-building campaign.
Right, the land reclamation. It's been going on for years now.
Since around 2013, maybe a bit earlier, China launched this massive land reclamation effort. The scale, the speed, it's really unprecedented.
But how much land are we talking about?
Over 3,200 acres in the Spratly Islands alone by 2025. That just dwarfs what any other claimant has done combined.
And these aren't just sandbanks anymore. We're talking about serious military outposts.
Absolutely. Places like Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, Mischief Reef, they've been transformed. You've got 3,000-meter runways, advanced radar, hardened shelters, barracks, deep water ports.
Capable of handling large military aircraft, warships.
Exactly. And then there are the weapon systems. There were reports, quite concerning ones, in early 2025 about deployments of advanced missiles.
Like the anti-ship missiles, the carrier killers.
Yes, the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles and potentially even hypersonic missiles reportedly deployed on Fiery Cross Reef. That really changes the military calculus in the region, raises the stakes significantly.
So the strategic purpose is pretty clear then. It's not just about planting flags.
Not at all. Militarily, these islands act as forward bases. They dramatically extend China's power projection capabilities across the South China Sea. They support their A2AD strategy, anti-access area denial.
Right, aimed at keeping potentially hostile forces, like the U.S. Navy, further away.
Precisely. Extends the range of their aircraft, ships, sensors. Economically, it reinforces their claims to resources. Politically, it's a very physical assertion of sovereignty.
Yeah, the U.S. response includes these freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs.
Yes. The U.S. Navy regularly sails warships and flies aircraft near these features to challenge what it considers excessive maritime claims, asserting rights under international law.
But China often pushes back using those gray zone tactics you mentioned earlier. Coast Guard, militias.
Exactly. They use non-Navy assets to harass or impede others, making it difficult to respond without escalating to military confrontation. It's about asserting dominance below the threshold of armed conflict.
We've seen examples, right? Harassing Filipino ships trying to resupply their outpost on Second Thomas Shoal.
Yes, the BRP Sierra Madre incidents. Using water cannons against Vietnamese fishing boats, buzzing U.S. surveillance aircraft. These are becoming more frequent.
It makes clear these artificial islands aren't just symbols anymore. They're functioning forward bases, changing the whole strategic map of Southeast Asia.
Fundamentally altering it.
Yeah.
And aiming, it seems, to reshape the regional order in China's favor.
And this activity in the South China Sea, it fits into a bigger picture, doesn't it? This concept called the island chain strategy.
Yes, absolutely. What China is doing in the South China Sea isn't happening in isolation. It's widely seen as a key part of this broader island chain strategy.
Which originally wasn't even a Chinese idea, right?
That's the interesting part. It was originally a U.S. concept from the Cold War, designed to contain the Soviet Union and China. Now China has sort of flipped it, using it as a framework for its own maritime expansion and counter-containment.
So how do these chains work? There's a first island chain?
Right. The first island chain runs roughly from the Kuril Islands down through Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, to Borneo. China's objective here seems to be achieving dominance, or at least significant control.
Why is that first chain so important for them?
Well, it secures their immediate maritime periphery, protects their coast, gives them control over vital sea lanes passing through, and crucially, it pushes U.S. military power further east, away from China's mainland. By 2025, many analysts assess China has achieved quite a bit of strategic influence within this chain, despite resistance, obviously, from Taiwan and Japan.
And then there's a second island chain further out.
Yes, the second island chain runs further into the Pacific through places like Guam, the Mariana Islands, Palau, and we're seeing China increasingly focus its attention and resources there too.
Guam being a major U.S. military hub.
A huge hub. So China's expanding Blue Water Navy, its efforts to gain influence in Pacific Island nations. Think Micronesia, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands. That's often interpreted as an effort to gain footholds and potentially breach or neutralize the strategic value of that second island chain for the U.S.
We hear about Chinese investment, diplomatic efforts in those islands. Is that part of it?
It's certainly seen that way. Financial investments, infrastructure projects, diplomatic overtures, they can all be seen as ways to potentially erode U.S. strategic depth and gain influence in areas traditionally aligned with the U.S.
And complementing this are developments in military tech, like long-range missiles.
Absolutely. The DF-26 missile, often dubbed the Guam killer, is a prime example. It's designed specifically to threaten key U.S. bases in the second island chain, like Guam, complicating U.S. logistics and power projection in a crisis.
So the logic is control the first chain, threaten the second.
That seems to be the strategic thinking. Dominance in the first island chain secures the near seas, while the ability to hold the second island chain at risk deters U.S. intervention, especially in scenarios involving Taiwan or the South China Sea itself. It secures China's vital sea lanes.
So the island chain strategy is really like a roadmap.
A roadmap for potentially displacing U.S. primacy in the Indo-Pacific, yeah. And controlling the South China Sea is a absolutely critical stepping stone on that path towards, well, a new Asian maritime order, potentially.
Which really brings us squarely back to the U.S.-China rivalry playing out there. It feels like the central arena for this great power competition.
It really does. It has echoes of the Cold War, like we said, but it's different, more complex, maybe less clear lines. For China, control, or at least dominance, in the South China Sea is vital for security, for those economic lifelines, and definitely for breaking that perceived U.S. encirclement.
And their tactics, we've discussed them, fortifying the islands, deploying missiles, and that cabbage strategy. Can you remind us what that is again?
Yeah, the cabbage strategy, it's about using multiple layers. Fishing boats, then maritime militia, then Coast Guard vessels, sometimes backed by the Navy further out. They sort of wrap around a contested feature or area like layers of a cabbage, gradually asserting control and squeezing out others without necessarily firing a shot.
Very descriptive. And the U.S. response has been to push back, intensify its presence.
Definitely. More PhonoPs, more carrier strike group deployments, B-52 bomber flights, constant surveillance patrols, all aimed at upholding freedom of navigation and reassuring allies.
And strengthening those alliances seems key, too.
Hugely important. We've seen intensified exercises like Balikatan with the Philippines, new access agreements for U.S. forces there under EDCA, more joint patrols with Japan, Australia. It's about building a network deterrence.
And things get tense. We've seen recent examples.
Yeah, reports like the USS Ronald Reagan carrier being closely shadowed by Chinese destroyers back in March 2025, or that incident in April with Chinese Coast Guard using water cannons on Filipino fishermen. These incidents really highlight the risks.
And trigger responses, like those joint U.S., Japan, Australian naval drills that followed the water cannon incident.
Exactly. It shows the action-reaction cycle is very much alive.
It really feels like this gray zone conflict, as you called it. It's not open warfare, but it's not peace either. Constant probing, pushing boundaries.
That's a perfect description. The rules are ambiguous, the intent isn't always clear, and the risk of miscalculation is always there. It lacks the sort of clear red lines, like nuclear deterrence, that structured the Cold War rivalry, which makes it potentially more unstable in some ways.
So the competition isn't just military. It's about narratives, influence, shaping the rules.
Absolutely. Military power, economic clout, diplomatic maneuvering, legal arguments, information campaigns, it's all part of the contest. And the South China Sea is the stage where this battle for future influence, maybe even world order leadership, is playing out most visibly right now.
Now, we've focused a lot on the U.S. and China, understandably. But other players have significant stakes, too. India, for instance. Geographically distant, but increasingly involved.
Very much so. India's importance in this whole equation has grown significantly. They've moved from a look east policy to a more proactive act east policy.
Meaning they see the South China Sea as relevant to their own interests.
Directly relevant. A huge chunk of India's trade passes through those waters, something like 55% by volume, plus vital energy imports. Any major disruption there hits India's economy and strategic autonomy hard.
So they're naturally building ties with countries in the region.
Exactly. Deepening partnerships with Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, Australia, Asian countries. We're seeing India increase its naval presence, participate more actively in multilateral exercises like Malabar, La Perouse, Milan.
And they've signed logistics agreements too, haven't they? Allowing their navy to operate more easily further from home.
Yes, logistics sharing agreements with key players like the U.S., Japan, Vietnam, the Philippines. It enhances their operational reach significantly.
What about things like resource exploration? I remember India drilling for oil with Vietnam.
Right. In Block 128, which is within Vietnam's claimed exclusive economic zone, but contested by China, India has continued its involvement there despite Chinese protests, signaling its commitment to operating under international law and supporting partners like Vietnam.
And diplomatically, India pushes for UNCLOS and freedom of navigation.
Consistently, at forums like ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, the Quad, India emphasizes the need for a rules-based order and adherence to international law, particularly UNCLOS.
They also have their own regional initiative, the IPOI.
The Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, yes.
Yeah.
It's framed as a cooperative, inclusive initiative focusing on maritime security, ecology, resources. It's often seen as offering an alternative model to China's Belt and Road Initiative, emphasizing equitable partnerships.
And India has its own concerns about China's growing influence closer to home, right? In South Asia, the Indian Ocean.
Absolutely. China's growing footprint in Pakistan through CPEC, its influence in Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Myanmar, plus its increasing naval presence in the Indian Ocean. These all create strategic vulnerabilities for India.
So for India, stability in the South China Sea isn't just about distant waters. It's part of a bigger strategic picture.
Precisely. It's about ensuring a stable, rules-based order across the entire Indo-Pacific, preventing the rise of a single dominant power, essentially, preventing a Sino-centric Asia, which they see as vital for their own long-term security and prosperity.
Well, this has been incredibly illuminating. We've really covered a lot of ground. It's crystal clear the South China Sea isn't just some remote maritime issue. It's arguably the most volatile, most significant maritime theater of our time.
It really is. It's where all these major global forces, interests, and anxieties intersect. And the transformation, just in the last decade or so, driven by China's actions, it's been profound.
The reclamation, the militarization, it's literally changed the map. And the response from the U.S. and its allies is trying to, I suppose, rebalance things or at least push back.
A very active pushback, yes.
Yeah.
Trying to deter further changes to the status quo. But like we've said, the risks of miscalculation, of unintended conflict, they seem to be growing despite those efforts.
And it's playing out on so many levels. Military, economic, legal, information, a true multi-domain competition.
At the end of the day, it goes beyond just who owns which reef or shoal. It's fundamentally about the future rules of the road internationally. It's about the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and perhaps globally.
So final thought maybe for you listening. What would a world actually look like if one single power achieved dominance over such a critical maritime crossroads? How might that ripple outwards and affect global stability, trade, maybe even aspects of your everyday life, no matter how far away you are from the South China Sea itself? Definitely something worth mulling over. Perhaps dig a bit deeper into UNCLOS or theories of international relations or the future of maritime law.